they cannot manufacture enough armored vehicles to keep up with the rate of loss as armored vehicles. And I think they probably care more about that than the losses of manpower. I mean, they still have great reserves that they could call on if they need to. So I don't think it's so much about casualties. I mean, we hear on radio intercepts, when Russians get hit in a particular sector, they call back and say, we've got wounded here, we can't push forward. And the commander will come back and say, like, I don't care, you've got to hold that position, doesn't matter, like, you don't evacuate. So the kind of the ruthlessness definitely still seems to be there, but just perhaps the availability of these armored vehicles is less.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by the Times journalist Maxim Tucker, who's currently in Odessa, having just returned from the Donbass. Maxim, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Hi, good to see you.
First of all, tell us a bit about your trip to the Donbass.
So we were based in Pokrovsk, and we went to the frontline area around Toretsk to see the latest Russian offensive, where they're trying to push forward and take the town of Toretsk, which has been was basically liberated by Ukrainians from the hybrid invasion in 2014 and has been very close to the front line ever since then. It hadn't been the subject of a major Russian push until recently. In the last month and a half, the Russians have tried to attack this area intensively. And basically what they're trying to do is, having run into difficulties with their offensive in Kharkiv and their offensive in Chasiv Yar for the really key town of Konstantinivka, which is really important strategic railway and road junction. They're trying to go through the Toretsk junction now to the south. So they're trying to move through Toretsk to take Konstantinivka. And they've realized that there was a weakness in the Ukrainian lines, because the Ukrainian lines are stretched very thin, and they've had to move troops to defend Chasiv Yar from that sector. So what Ukraine has now had to do is take troops in from brigades from other sectors of the front line and put them in there to plug the hole. And this is a kind of constant game of cat and mouse now. The Russians are probing for weaknesses in the front line. They gain a few footholds in villages, and then Ukraine has to redeploy some forces to try and drive them out.
What is the nature of the fighting we're seeing around Toretsk?
So the nature of the fighting has changed very drastically. I mean, the Russians now, they seem to be running low on armored vehicles, and they definitely don't want to use them as a kind of wasteful way that they've been using before. So the way that the Russians are trying to capture villages now, they send in very small groups of infantry, perhaps 3 or 4 at a time, try and hide from the persistent drone coverage that the Ukrainians have. And the drones are such a big feature of this war now. There's nowhere that you can't see, apart from in the undergrowth and in the tree lines. The only people that can hide effectively there really and move forward are infantry. So what the Russians are doing is trying to send in 3 or 4 guys, try and find a house or a basement or a position where they can then send another 3 or 4 guys and another 3 or 4 guys until they've grouped enough people there to attack a Ukrainian position. What these troops are also doing is probing Ukrainian lines to try and find out where the Ukrainian strong points are and then bombard them with artillery or glide bombs. But obviously, Ukrainians are aware of this. They're looking out. They're trying to find these guys with drones. The infantry call in when they make contact, and then the Ukrainians deploy first-person view drones. With reconnaissance drones, they try and hit them with artillery. And this is such the Donbass is in such ruins now. It's very hard to find shelter. If they find a few intact houses, Ukrainians quite quickly cotton onto them and hit them with artillery or FPV drones. And that seems to be, now that there are new brigades deployed in that area, it seems to be holding for now the Russia's offensive here.
And is that change of tactical approach in terms of sending in fewer infantry to begin with, is that very new?
It's something that I think we saw in Kharkiv. The difference, I think, in the Kharkiv offensive was that they had quad bikes and other things to move much more rapidly, and the troops in the Kharkiv offensive seemed to be very highly trained. And we spoke to a few people who said that these were Spetsnaz, special operations forces, that were attacking through that area. But definitely, because of the nature of the drone warfare, everyone can see everything. It's very difficult to get armored vehicles into position, and before the Kharkiv offensive, it was still very much a case of the Russians sending columns of mechanized armored vehicles into battle and hoping by sheer force of numbers to break through the lines. That seems to be increasingly difficult, and they don't have perhaps as many of those to spare as they did before. So, since the Kharkiv offensive, and certainly in the Donbass over the last month and a half, this is what the Russians seem to be focused on trying to do. But the problem for them is they can maybe take some villages, but it's very difficult to generate momentum to have a very fast-moving offensive when you don't have armored vehicles at those. Perhaps what they're doing is to try and provoke a weakness, hit those positions with artillery, try the Ukrainian lines down, and then perhaps they would try and send in armored columns if they made a breakthrough.
How strategically significant would you say Toretsk is?
Well, it's important because it's on this road to Konstantinivka. Konstantinivka is really the goal here, because if the Russians can take Konstantinivka, it means that they really hamper Ukrainian logistics. They can sever logistics lines through that railway, through that road junction. And it also starts to flank Ukrainian troops in Chasiv Yar, which is a really, really strong position for the Ukrainians. The Russians would be throwing themselves against Chasiv Yar, which is on the heights. It's defended by canals. So it's a very good strategic position for the Ukrainians to hold on to. And the Russians have realized after really a very long time of attacking Chasiv Yar that perhaps it's easier to go through Toretsk. Now, Toretsk is a city, as I said, that has been on the front line since 2014, and it's since the full-scale invasion has been completely destroyed by Russian glide bombs and artillery. So it's very hard for Ukrainian soldiers there to find cover. It's very hard for Ukrainian logistics to move through the city without being exposed, because there aren't all these tall buildings that used to be there in the way of the Russian drones. So the Russians can see them, they can spot them, and they can hit them going in. So it seems to be a better strategic option, a weakness in the Ukrainian flank to attack. But now the Ukrainians have moved in brigades, new brigades there. Then we might see the Russians probe somewhere else and try to advance somewhere else.
You mentioned the drone warfare. Obviously, throughout the conflict, we've seen huge innovations, particularly on the Ukrainian side, of using often quite low-cost commercial drones to great effect on the battlefield. Are we still seeing innovations all the time?
Yeah, there is all kinds of hacks that the Ukrainians do. Obviously, the Chinese manufacturer of these drones have said they don't want them to be used for military purposes. I mean, whether they really can, I mean, given how many, the numbers that they're selling to both Ukraine and Russia. But, they've introduced different things that are for civilian features that, you can locate different drones, and it's like a kind of social media network for drones, so you can see where other DJI users are. And Ukrainians constantly have to try and fix these with kind of hacked patches of the software to make sure that, they're not revealing their positions. They've also found out that there are internal sensors in some of the drones that they can use as additional cameras. They weren't using those cameras before. And it's a constant kind of battle for upgrading of the hardware and the software to make sure that you have an advantage. Plus, both sides now have better electronic warfare devices. Now you see all the Ukrainian vehicles that we travel in when we go to frontline positions, they always have to have electronic warfare countermeasures. We won't travel to the front line without them, because the risk of FPV drone strikes on us is so high. But the Russians also have them, and they're now at the point where you can easily fit them in a backpack. So you have individual soldiers wearing these electronic countermeasures. And so when Ukrainian drones go over, to try and find the Russians, you start seeing the signal strength be lost on the drone feeds. And Ukrainian drone pilots have to try and maneuver and zoom out and go somewhere else to try and get a different angle on the Russians where the signal isn't interfered with. One of the things that I was told, which is very interesting, is at the beginning of this kind of month and a half new offensive, Russia had obviously very carefully prepared its FPV drone pilots in a way that they hadn't before, and they started using a new frequency which they hadn't used before, and a lot of the electronic countermeasures were not adapted to block, and they attacked in large numbers with FPV Ukrainian logistics line on this new frequency. The jamming wasn't working, and they had quite a lot of success, which is one of the reasons they were able to push forward in that sector.
I thought it was interesting. You wrote a great piece for the Times last week when you talk about how Ukrainian troops are using Google Hangouts. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's fascinating to see the way that kind of all of this civilian technology is being put to use in military purposes. I asked, when was the start of this? It seems to be quite a long time that people have been using these secure devices like Google Hangouts, relatively secure, and WhatsApp, relatively secure from Russian hacking. And apparently this is something that just happened organically, and then more and more units were using it. But it's very weird. If you've ever been in a Google Hangout with your friends and you kind of have that situation. I remember during the pandemic playing poker with my friends online, and you see a group of faces on the screen and you're talking and chatting. And then to see that juxtaposed with drone pilots falling in Russian positions and people talking to each other about where the Russians are now in this Google Hangout, and then they screenshot maybe the location of the Russians on a map or particularly drone feed, they send it on WhatsApp, they get commands through these Google Hangouts. So it's very interesting to see this kind of stuff that we're so used to seeing in our everyday life. It's be used for a completely different purpose than the Russians.
Just to go back to some of the new tactics we're seeing from Russia now, particularly in Toretsk, is that in any way a sign of the Russian casualty rate having an impact and them wanting to reduce it? The fact they're just sending in fewer infantry in sort of, groups of 3 or 4, is that to do with the Russian casualty rate at all?
I think it's more a reflection of the nature of the drone warfare, because if you have a large number of people, you can see their movies, and they're trying to infiltrate Ukrainian positions. They're trying to use small groups and then build. So it's a trying to accommodate for the fact that there's nowhere really to hide on the modern battlefield. It's very, very difficult to attack a position unseen. And I think, there was an interesting report in The Economist that said that Russians are kind of their storage, Soviet era storage of weapons that they produced at that time, which was absolutely vast, starting to be depleted. And perhaps they are conscious that they cannot manufacture enough armored vehicles to keep up with the rate of loss as armored vehicles. And I think they probably care more about that than the losses of manpower. I mean, they still have great reserves that they could fall on if they need to. So I don't think it's so much about casualties. I mean, we hear on radio intercepts, when Russians get hit in a particular sector, they call back and say, we've got wounded here, we can't push forward. And the commander will come back and say, like, I don't care, you've got to hold that position, doesn't matter, like, you don't evacuate. So the kind of the ruthlessness definitely still seems to be there, but just perhaps the availability of these armored vehicles is less. And also they just haven't found an effective tactic. I mean, they gained in this sector maybe 5 kilometers quite rapidly, but then after the Ukrainians brought in new brigades, it slowed significantly. And I think the Russians see that they're throwing all these forces against the Ukrainians, and they make incremental gains. Since the beginning of the war, there haven't really been like great big Russian breakthroughs. So everyone is just trying new different tactics, different strategies to try and find some kind of advantage on the battlefield that is otherwise very much a stalemate.
Is it your sense, Maxim, that the Russian offensive that began in sort of the early spring has somewhat stalled? Could we go that far?
Yeah, I think in the Kharkiv offensive hasn't got anywhere near where they wanted to get. I think they needed to take Lipsy, this village, which is within artillery range of Kharkiv cities. So no, they needed to take that so that they could basically bombard Kharkiv and make Ukraine's second largest city untenable to live in. They haven't managed to do that, and that's not very far from the Russian border. So I think, that area of the offensive has now stalled, and they are looking for different places to push. And Toretsk maybe being one of them, but again, the Ukrainians seem to have reacted quite well to that, reactive in a timely fashion, and they're holding them for now. But we have to recognize Ukraine is, the troops are spread really, really thin. They're having to move brigades around different places to try and counteract the Russian threat. And these brigades have been fighting for a long time. They're really tired. And until Ukraine's kind of mobilization drive kicks in and kind of more trained recruits are kind of coming to the frontline areas to reinforce them, there is a danger that these are kind of exhausted troops will make mistakes, will let Russians slip through. I mean, a lot of this work depends on drone operators looking at drone feeds, 8 hours a day, maybe longer. Their commanders looking at it, making sure that they can see every time you get a small group of 3 or 4 Russians get through. Because if you miss those Russians, then they start to build up in a position where they can attack and take your position. And some of the people that we were talking to, I'm doing work on dispatch now, which is about the 47th Brigade. It's one of the kind of elite brigades that was equipped with Western equipment. They've got Bradley fighting vehicles, and the dispatch is about how effective these vehicles are. Even they were designed in the 1970s, 80s. And they're still effective against FPV drones today, which is a threat that they probably never expected to face. But, some of those crews, we were speaking to them, and I would say, how is the situation here? And it's near Rodivka, which is another place that Russians are trying to push. How is the situation now? And they say it's more or less calm. And we're sitting there, we can hear like cluster munitions coming in, there's multiple launch rocket systems coming in, like Bradleys are calling in that they've been hit or by an FPV drone strike. And for them, this is relative calm because they've been in the Zaporizhia counteroffensive. They were fighting in Avdiivka. But that's a bad situation for your troops to be in. If your troops are so tired that they think it's calm and it's normal when you're being hit with artillery to that degree, then they're not going to react quickly enough to threats. So they're not going to get on the deck. Some of them won't wear body armor anymore because it's so hot here. That's a dangerous point. You want troops who are, that know the positions they're in. The ideal point is when they're quite familiarized with the positions they're in, maybe like a month, 2 weeks in, but are still alert to the dangers that they face. taking cover where they need to take cover. One of those crews, they were very casual when we visited them, and they said it wasn't really a dangerous place. And we went back to the command center and spent some time with the commander of that battalion. And then, 5 minutes later, they were calling in that they were being targeted by 152 millimeter artillery. So, they were still in a very dangerous place, and they were not really thinking that it was dangerous.
Just picking up on your conversations with Ukrainian troops, how would you sum up Ukrainian morale at the moment?
I think they're very frustrated. They're very tired. So many of these losses they feel could have been avoided. They appreciate the Western support, but they don't understand why there are such delays. And it comes in dribs and drabs, and it's never enough quantity at the right time to inflict a kind of decisive blow on the Russians, a decisive defeat that would say, okay, that would force the Russians to come to the negotiating table. I think everyone is starting to be realistic that there needs to be some kind of negotiated settlement, but they cannot do it from a position of weakness. They need to have a victory hound to go to the Russians and say that let's negotiate for favorable terms. Otherwise, we just have Putin saying, "I want these 4 oblasts, which I've got, taken some part of." So I think there's frustration, there is tiredness, there is obviously a sense of loss because they've lost so many people, but also a frustration with their own government because they feel that the recruitment campaign isn't going very well, and society in Ukraine has the idea that if you are going to the front line, you will almost certainly be killed. And one commander that we spoke to said, "Look, it's not right. Yes, out of a company of 100 people during one campaign, maybe 5 to 7 people get killed, and might have 20 to 30 wounded in some degree or other. But you get other people who are sick, other people who need to go visit elderly parents, or has like a third child, and that releases you from the military." And they're just tired. You need more troops to give the guys who've been fighting on the front lines for 2 years a break. They really need that break for some of the reasons I just described. You lose your alertness, your sense of normal is distorted. And that is the reason, really, the Ukrainians should be saying, this is the reason we need a mobilization campaign, an improvement campaign. Not because everyone's died, but because the guys who are fighting on the front line need a rest. And that would be better messaging. And they're frustrated that the government stopped doing that, that they're, instead of inspiring people, motivating people to fight, they're just dragging them off the street. And that's all, when that happens, the Russians make a huge deal of it, and it scares other people, and you get this exodus of people now trying however they can to leave the country because they think it's, better to risk your life swimming across a very dangerous river than go to the front line because you have a better chance of surviving the swim of the river, even though many of those people are dying there. So the messaging needs to be improved for the campaigning.
Yeah, how has that misconception been allowed to take hold? Is it just that the messaging from the Ukrainian government isn't good enough? Is it Russian propaganda feeding into it? Is it a mixture?
It's always a mixture. I mean, there's often a grain of truth to the Russian propaganda. They're very good at finding a kind of element, a divisive point in Ukrainian society and playing it up and playing it up. So, if there were a handful of videos of people being taken off the street into buses for whatever reason, yes, those videos are broadcast without any context. Just looks like Ukrainian recruiters are just press ganging everyone. They're played everywhere. They make sure that everyone sees those videos. And probably they shouldn't have been allowed to happen in the first place. The way that Ukraine recruits people and it explains why they're taking people into custody. It might be that person was already called to the military office. They should have already gone to have a health checkup, but they didn't do any of the things that they were obliged to do. And then that carries with it some penalties. But none of that's being explained really well. Obviously, the Ukrainian government has other things that it's focused on. It's really its focus is always trying to get, is in diplomacy, trying to get more Western weapons in order to continue the fight. But I think some of the early messaging from Zelensky was very helpful when he had this rift with Zelensky. And he said, look, the army has asked me for 500,000 people, but I'm going to say no. And he basically portrayed himself as the kind of defender of Ukrainian civilian society, holding back the military from wanting to take all the soldiers. And which he did for his own popularity benefit, really. Once you set that framing, it's very difficult to unravel it. So when the army now say, we need these people to defend the Donbass, it's difficult for him to say, okay, I was defending you against this army who have this rapacious, hungry people that just want more people for the meat grinder. Now he has to change that framing, and they haven't done that very well.
I mentioned you have been in the Donbass. You're now in Odessa. What is the situation there, particularly when it comes to the city's air defences?
So I think the city air defences they've they've obviously been eroded by the fact that they've had to use a hell of a lot of missiles to intercept Russian missiles that come off over the Black Sea. They have good systems, but they ran very low for a time when the US was holding up its 60 billion in aid. And you still see like a lot of missiles get through, and the Russians changed their tactics. Before they were flying the drones very low to avoid detection. Now they decided we'll fly the drones very high so that you can't use bullets to shoot them down. You have to waste your missiles to shoot them down. And we fly the missiles very low, so it's hard to spot. So they've kind of reversed what they were doing before. But I think the really interesting thing that I've seen in Odessa, I'm here reporting on some of the developments of Black Sea. There'll be some interesting things to talk about going forward. But what's been very interesting to see in a city where it's kind of been 35 degrees is the impact of Russian strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. There are blackouts, on and off, rolling blackouts. And then one day it was 35 degrees and the water was shut down. There was no running water because there was no water to pump for a full day. And that's happening on and off and on and off because so many of these electric power stations have been destroyed now. And, most of them are beyond repair, actually. So Ukraine is having to try and import energy from neighboring European countries and find a very quick solution to this energy crisis. Obviously, when it's 35 degrees, everyone's got their air conditioners going, and that encourages the blackouts because, there's not enough power for the grid at that point. But people, are really suffering. They can't do their jobs. They can't, people can't keep their food cold in the fridges. You can't use the bathroom because you've got no running water. It really interrupts the Ukrainian economy, the Ukrainian way of life, and civilians, I think, are really starting to feel the difficulty. And that will encourage probably a new wave of migration of refugees going to Europe, if not now, certainly in the winter when people will be very cold. And they won't be able to maintain an ordinary life. You can't do a job. You can't work. It's very difficult to operate in those circumstances. And what Ukrainians have tried to do is get their own generators. So there's generators whirring throughout the city. They're very loud. They create a lot of air pollution. It's that's been a kind of short-term solution, but it's very difficult to provide enough power to power like everything that you need in an apartment block, for example, using a generator.
You mentioned the Black Sea. Obviously, Odessa's on the edge of the Black Sea, and Ukraine has had tremendous success at degrading the Black Sea Fleet, for instance, and has continued drone strikes against Crimea. Is there a real sense that region is crucial for Ukraine now going forward?
Yeah, the Black Sea is essential for Ukraine's economy. You need they need to be able to use those sea routes to export grain, to import the vital foodstuffs and other things into Ukraine. And they have managed to do that. I mean, it's very impressive that the Ukrainian Navy have been completely outgunned, and so many more ships in the Russian Black Fleet. The Ukrainian Navy, together with Ukrainian military intelligence and Ukraine State Security Service, have struck so many Russian vessels in the Black Sea that they are combined to ports not only in Crimea, because there have been strikes inside ports in Crimea as well, but more often way over to the Russian side of the coast. And that has allowed ships to operate through this kind of unilateral grain corridor that Ukraine has created. That's really important. But there's also a sense, that Ukraine could really manage to isolate Crimea and make it difficult for the Russians to keep their bases there. And that's very important because as long as you have Russian air bases on Crimea, it offers the opportunity to strike anywhere on the south of Ukraine and even deeper. And it's another direction that you have to defend against with your kind of limited air defense capabilities. And so isolating the Russians there, making sure they can't get supplies across the Kerch Bridge, making sure that ships can't resupply those areas is going to be really crucial to the Ukrainian warfare. It's one of the few areas that we've seen success and optimism in the last year.
I mean, the Kerch Bridge, when you talk about isolating Crimea, is the Kerch Bridge the key?
The Kerch Bridge is hugely important, and the rail link there is really important. We've seen Ukrainian attempts to bring that down, so, with some success. I think the question is, when is the most strategic time for them to do that? What missiles are they using? Every time that they use kind of storm shadows, the Russians learn a bit more about them. If they use other kinds of missiles, the Russians will learn a bit more about them. So they don't have so many, and more importantly, more crucially, they don't have so many jets to use the storm shadows. They run quite low on those jets that they need. So I think we can expect more attacks on the Kerch Bridge. The Russians are trying to defend it more effectively, trying to adapt it. there were some drone strikes on the Kerch Bridge, which also damaged it. But I think there will be a point when the Ukrainians will be trying to hit that bridge hard and disable it. And it just depends on where they can apply their resources at any one point in the section. It's such a big front line. You're thinking about Kharkiv all the way down to the Kherson region. It's just an enormous front line you have to defend, and if you're going to have a kind of offensive operation like the kind you would need to disable the Kerch Bridge and then capitalize on it by striking the Russians at Crimea. Because if you disable the Kerch Bridge but you don't do much about the Russian bases on Crimea, there's not much point. You have to do both of those things at the same time. So they need to concentrate forces. It's very difficult for them now where they have manpower shortages. And they're still reporting, delays in Western weaponry. A lot of the brigades in Donbass said, we haven't had anything. One guy said we've had 4 Mark 19 automatic grenade launchers since the 60 billion package, and that's it for an entire brigade. And he thinks maybe that's because a lot of it has been shipped to Kharkiv because that was the most pressing need initially. But it's very, very slow going, and it doesn't come in huge amounts. Some of that is because of production difficulties in the West, but also a lot of it is just political will.
And another area we've seen Ukraine having success is also drone strikes on places like Rostov Oblast inside Russia. How significant would you say that is?
It's huge. I mean, taking the war to Russia is a really, really important part. Ukraine cannot just fight a defensive war when all of its infrastructure is being torn apart and it's not able to hit Russian infrastructure. And the things that are allowing Russia to wage war effectively, the oil depots, the kind of munitions factories, things like that, deep inside Russia, Ukraine needs to be able to strike those. And obviously the UK has been helpful recently and realistic and practical in saying, yes, you can use our munitions to strike targets inside Russia, military targets inside Russia. It's very strange that the US still says we're limiting the way that we use our weapons, forcing Ukraine to fight a kind of very one-sided war. But Ukraine anyway has been adapting to developing its own drones. We've seen some of these long-range strikes are very innovative. They just kind of bought kind of Italian kit planes, put them together, put kind of different hardware and software in order to remote guide it, and then strike very, very long distances inside Russia where the Russians weren't expecting it. But as everything with this war, when you start doing something that's new, the enemy tries to adapt to it and will discover how you're doing it and find new ways of stopping it. So the Russians will see now that they're using these kit planes, they kind of will have an idea of what kind of range they can reach and try and install their defenses to stop that happening. I mean, it's still effective because it stretches Russian resources more thinly, and I think the Ukrainians, will be developing more drone capabilities. It can have these longer range strikes and are very effective. Just today we saw an oil refinery in Russia was hit, and that will have an impact on the Russian war effort.
And just finally, Maxim, you've obviously reported from Ukraine a lot over recent years. From your conversations this time around, sum up, if you can, the general mood amongst Ukrainian troops about where they think the war is at the moment and what the state of play is.
I think the main talking point in the trenches has really been what's going to happen with the US elections. Is that going to just totally undo us? Because if US aid stops, this war is unwinnable. They will continue to defend and continue to fight, but it just takes away any kind of hopes of what will Trump do if he's elected. What's happening with Biden? Why is he still running when he's obviously had so many gaffes? They're really, really worried about this. What will the future like without US support? And I think that there is not that sense of optimism certainly that we had before the summer counteroffensive last year. There's not we talked about plans of something similar like that. You ask them is it even possible that Ukraine could mount a counteroffensive? Do you have the resources to do that? Every brigade says no, there's no way that we could mount a counteroffensive now. It's just going to be a defensive war for the foreseeable future. And obviously that could change if political decision making change, and the US decided we'll give Ukraine what it wants, when it wants, and in the numbers that it wants. But for now, it's a kind of, we're holding on, we're still determined, but we don't see how this is going to end or when this is going to end.
Maxim, always appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us today on Frontline.
Thanks very much, James.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more, click subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can listen to Times Radio, and you can read more about the war in Ukraine and global security with your Times digital subscription.